Welcome to Doing the Work, frontline stories of social change, where we bring you stories of real people working to address real issues. I am your host, Shimon Cohen. I'm excited to let everyone know about the Doing the Work collection in partnership with Things Social Workers Say. We've got hoodies, tees, mugs, and tote bags. Now you can rep the podcast you love while you're doing the work. Check out the link in the show notes and head on over to the store. Thanks for supporting this work. In this episode, I talk with Reid, who is a professional officer and anti-racism visionary at the British Association of Social Workers, BASW. Wayne is my first international guest, and I'm so grateful. Wayne talks about how his understanding of anti-racism in social work and his motivation for speaking out and taking action was catalyzed by the murder of George Floyd. He discusses a number of projects he and BASW have been working on specific to anti-racism in social work. Check out the link to his extensive portfolio in the show notes. These are excellent resources. Wayne shares what anti-racist social work means to him and how a concept that should be straightforward becomes very complex in application due to the embeddedness of white supremacy and racism in laws, policies, institutions, beliefs, and actions. We discuss how no one wants to say they are racist, but actions that support racist policies are being done in the regular operations of social work practice. Wayne talks about his pure, proactive, and unapologetic approach to anti-racism within social work and the need for this approach due to constantly being up against white supremacy, both as a black man and as a black male social worker. He discusses the need for social workers to practice anti-racism as part of our standards of conduct, not just with clients, but with colleagues, and the need for organizations to provide protections and support for social workers of color that explicitly address the many forms of institutional and interpersonal racism they experience, as well as steps organizations can take to transform into anti-racist organizations. Wayne also shares how he got into this work. I hope this conversation inspires you to action. Before we get into the interview, I want to let you all know about our episode's sponsor, the University of Tennessee Knoxville College of Social Work. First off, I want to thank them for sponsoring the podcast. UTK has a phenomenal social work program with the opportunity to do your bachelor's, master's, and doctorate of social work online. Of course, they also have excellent classes in person in both Knoxville and Nashville. UTK is committed to preparing social workers who will support human potential and dignity and challenge racism and all forms of oppression. Scholarships are available. Go to www.csw.utk.edu to learn more. And now, the interview. Hey Wayne, thanks so much for coming on Doing the Work. I'm really excited to talk with you. I've been following your work for a while. I know we got to connect on Twitter and now LinkedIn. And let's just start off by you letting the listeners know a little bit about yourself and what you currently do.
Okay, thank you, Shimon, for having me on Doing the Work. I really appreciate that. My role, I work for an organisation in England called the British Association of Social Workers. We are a UK-wide organisation, but I work in the England team. My work over the last just over 12 months since George Floyd's murder has been primarily around anti-racism in social work. Although I do have a sort of substantive role at BASW, where I'm a generic professional officer, and I'm involved in various aspects of social work in terms of specialisms such as mental health, criminal justice, etc. But as I mentioned, over the last 12 months, a lot of my work has been focused really on anti-racism in social work, and I've been involved in various initiatives and projects, which has been really fruitful.
So, yeah, I'm so interested to have that conversation because it seems that historically anti-racist social work has been more discussed in England than in the United States.
Right.
And you're my first international interview, so
I'm honored.
You get the credit for that, right?
Ah.
So I'm wondering, like, maybe if you could talk a little bit about your experience with the history of anti-racist social work in England, and now what is maybe different, and what's happening now, and kind of the direction you
Mhm.
see things going.
Okay, I mean, my own personal involvement with anti-racism in social work, to be honest, has been very brief. Just during that period I've described, since George Floyd's murder, it was that incident that really, I guess, kick-started me, instigated me to become more outspoken and more vocal about my opinions about racism within social work specifically. In terms of the profession and its history with anti-racism, I only really became aware of anti-racism in social work again around the time of George Floyd's murder, as in terms of the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement globally. Suddenly that term sort of came on my radar, having worked in social work for around, social work and social care, because they are distinct in the UK. But having worked in that arena for the best part of 20 years, I'd never really heard of anti-racism, to be honest. There was a history, and there is a definite core fundamental aspect to social work in terms of anti-oppression and anti-discrimination. And those were values and ethics which I was sort of supported with and introduced to by veteran social workers earlier on in my career. And then when I undertook my degree to become a qualified social worker, those were values that were mentioned. It's still fairly intrinsic, I think, to social work at that time. But sadly, over the last 10 years or so, since austerity that you may have heard of possibly, that's impacted the UK, I feel it's really slid off the agenda. And then the alignment of George Floyd's murder kind of brought all that into sharp focus of how it was really impacting, communities and society and so on, and minoritized groups. So, yeah, there was a lot of different tectonic plates almost that just seemed to kind of align over the last year. But I hope, that gives some insight into how we've arrived at the point where we have in England.
Absolutely. The work you're doing now focused on anti-racist social work in England with BASW. What have you been doing? Tell us about what you've been doing.
Well, I've been doing a bit of this and a bit of that, really. There's a number of different things. So there's a book called Outlanders, The Hidden Narratives of Social Workers of Colour, which I compiled and co-edited with a social worker called Siobhan McLean, who's also what's called a practice educator over here. Those are the people who would support social work students throughout their studies. And Siobhan is also a publisher as well. We had the idea of coming up with a book, and we came up with the name Outlanders because we just thought it described perfectly the experiences of social workers of colour in England and the UK. So that publication includes essays, stories, poems and other miscellaneous works from the perspectives of Black and ethnic minority social workers specifically. So it's quite unique, so we're particularly proud of that. There's a group in my organisation, BASW, that I've created, which is called the Black and Ethnic Minority Professional Symposium, or BPS. And that group consists of 15 social workers across England, all from different social work specialist backgrounds. So some are in children and families, some might be working with adults, some might be in the mental health service, for example. So they're all in different locations across England, but we come together to create a space for them to be able to offload, because that's very necessary because of the, institutional racism that we face in social work. And also it's a good space for us to be able to strategize and mobilize, really, in terms of some of the innovations and campaigns and resources, that we want to kind of develop and look at. There's various things, Shimon, that I could talk about. In terms of George Floyd's anniversary, for example, which has recently passed, I authored a report for BASW, which compiled all of the anti-racism in social work activities that have taken place across England, the UK, over that 12-month period in terms of the anniversary. And it was very extensive. It's available on the BASW website. So again, there's all sorts of stuff that I've been doing. Really, I could go on, but I'll perhaps share my portfolio with you, and you might be able to share that with our listeners, perhaps.
Absolutely, yeah. I can link that in the show notes, and also a link on the podcast website. I wanted to come back to a couple things you've said, right? So the first, I think, is that, and these go directly, these connect together. The first is that you talked about that you've been working in social work for about 20 years and hadn't heard of anti-racist social work, right? And I can really relate to that as well. It took me a long time to come to that terminology. It was not taught in any of the programs in my education. Right. And so when I heard you saying that, I really resonated with that. And so then you also talked about institutional racism in social work, right? And that's part of the institutional racism is the fact that it's not discussed in education. So then social workers are leaving and practicing social work in a certain way, right? Without this anti-racist framework, analysis, and practice. So I was kind of wondering if you could talk about that. Like, what does anti-racist social work mean to you and look like, in practice? And I understand there's not going to be like one clear way because different practice contexts, but like if you could kind of say what it means to you and kind of like what that means for you to put into practice.
Okay. For me, I subscribe to the definition by Ibram X. Kendi in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. I don't know if you're familiar with that book, Shimon.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, it was it is a big hit over here as well. And the definition that he outlines is that it's a belief that all races and ethnic groups are equal and deserving of the same opportunities, and that anti-racism, the crux of it really, is about doing something, so taking action about the existing inequality. And although that might seem very straightforward, I think in reality, actually, although it is simple, it's just not seen in that simplistic way. It's sort of overcomplicated. It really requires people to not be asking questions of, do we have any racism here? Or does institutional racism really exist? It's more a question of it clearly does. There's an overwhelming base of evidence. I'm sure there is globally, not just in England. So it's sort of a case of, why are people sat on their hands? Why aren't they doing something? And some of that points directly towards white supremacy for me. And I'm not saying that in a kind of, in a way where I'm pointing the finger necessarily. It's more about people not recognizing those existing structures, processes and policies, procedures, etc., which are just inherently racist. They're just going along with them blindly, and not actually, thinking critically or being self-aware about how that actually impacts and influences their decisions and their actions. They're just taking the position that, well, I'm not racist. Do you know what I mean? Nobody wants to admit being a racist, but they are actually impacted by the racist structures and systems and things that are in place, and nobody's immune from that. So I hope that, kind of is coherent in terms of my perspective on anti-racism. In terms of institutional racism, I've written quite a bit about that. And again, some of the articles will be available in the portfolio I send you. They're all hyperlinks on there, so all the stuff is on the internet. And in terms of social work, I think there's undoubtedly indicators of institutional racism, but so is there in many other professions. Social work isn't specifically institutionally racist. Most, if not all, institutions and organizations to some degree are. It's where on that spectrum they are. But they have to acknowledge it exists to begin with before they can even, judge where they are. So yeah, that's my take on institutional racism. And I suppose I'd just end that by saying that again, I subscribe to the view of the William McPherson report. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but that was a report that was written as a consequence of the murder of Stephen Lawrence, which was a huge high-profile case in England in the 90s of a young black male who was killed. And, there's lots more to that story, but it was very high-profile. And the independent report that was written concluded that institutional racism was prevalent within the police force. I think that has some correlations with social work. But I also think that we need to also talk about racist policies and their effect on the experiences of social workers of colour and service users of colour as well.
Absolutely. And the analysis we should have as social workers is that we're always looking at policy.
Yes.
Right. And I think something that is important to point out, and you're right, that institutional racism is not unique to social work. It's across all fields, professions. But social work is different in the sense that we say we're all about social justice, right? Like some of these other professions don't claim to be that. So we're claiming to be something and then we're not, right? Yeah. So I think that also is a barrier to then doing work on it. And I was wondering, because then it's kind of like what you said, like when people are like, well, I'm not racist. It's like, where are the racists? You're not racist. I'm not racist. Yeah. But yet the actions are racist because they're supporting, these racist policies and and harm is being done all under the guise of social justice.
Yeah, I agree. And I in terms of my experiences of social work, I observe that there is a kind of complacency where people think, well, I learned about this stuff at uni, or as you say, it's kind of something that is discussed in social work. It's referred to perhaps more than other professions. So because of that, people think, well, we're doing our bit. Other professions aren't, or other professionals aren't. But I do think there is a big difference between talking the talk and walking the walk. And in academia, within social work in England and the UK, there is a strong body of work around anti-racism that, as I say, I wasn't really aware of prior to George Floyd's murder, but I've certainly unearthed it in the last year or so. And then there's other interrelated aspects as well, or kind of interlinked factors, such as cultural competence, for example. And part of the rhetoric within social work in England at the moment is around equality, diversity and inclusion, which then considers the range of protected characteristics such as disability, gender, sexuality, and so on. But also then looking at it in terms of ethnic diversity, cultural diversity, religion, the inclusion of people from some of those minoritized groups. But my critique of that, I suppose, is that it's very necessary to look at things from that perspective sometimes, but not all of the time. Sometimes we need to look at these things in terms of their individual kind of validity, I suppose, and their individual relevance in a particular situation, and kind of deconstruct and reconstruct that. Instead, there seems to be a sort of tendency to just look at things in the round, would be my view. And I think that, that disadvantages all of those groups, really.
Yeah. I also think, I was taught about cultural competence, in social work education, and I wanted to be, like a good social worker. And, as someone who's white and male, I wanted to be culturally competent. And then over time, I've learned that there's actually a really strong critique of cultural competence as perpetuating racism, in the sense that we can't be competent, number one, in someone else's culture. This whole idea of competence is a very power ego type
That's true.
And also, it doesn't have a power analysis, right? So like cultural competence is like, to me, anti-racism would have an analysis of power, like who has power, predominantly white people, right? And who's being targeted historically and currently, people of color, specifically black folks, and then on that scale of black proximity to blackness, right?
Yeah.
And cultural competence doesn't really address that. It's like, okay, so I'm of this culture, you're of that culture. Let's just learn each other's cultures and everything's good. You know?
I do. Yeah. And I would say every day is a school day, because I've not really considered cultural competence, I suppose, to that degree. You know, I've learned about it as part of my studies going back some years, and it's something I'm aware has been critiqued. I suppose, speaking quite honestly, I don't really consider myself as an academic, Shimon. I've always considered myself as a practitioner when I was in frontline practice in different roles. And now, I mean, I've not been in frontline roles in my role at BASW for 4 years, but since I've been doing the anti-racism work, I've seen myself, I guess, more as an activist now. So in terms of talking about it, you know, obviously I'm doing a podcast, so it's slightly ironic, but I don't really almost want to focus too much on the talking about it, because there's a lot of talk that's gone on, if you see what I mean, about anti-racism. But in terms of outputs and outcomes, less so. So it's more about just getting stuff done for me. You see what I mean? So in terms of cultural competence, I suppose there are different ways in which what we're talking about can be framed and can be articulated. But for me, it's like, well, whatever we're calling it, great. Let's just crack on and do it. Do you see what I mean? And if we don't
you're
get
about
it right,
the action.
Exactly. And if we don't get it right first time, then we just go back to the drawing board and say, right, how can we improve that and refine it? So yeah, that's my emphasis. But I appreciate it's not universally, kind of. I'm sure not everybody sees everything from that point of view.
No, I mean, I think it takes a lot of different folks, you know, to do this work together. And, you know, let's get back to that part. So I know in your writing, you talk about being pure, proactive, and unapologetic.
Yeah.
You know, what does that mean to you, and how do you put that into action, to get back to the action part?
Okay. So being pure, proactive, and unapologetic is really about me not speaking on behalf of anybody else, just speaking for myself, really, which is difficult to navigate sometimes. But it's also about, I guess, me being quite forthright and militant, I guess, in some of the ways that I've had to approach anti-racism in social work, just by sheer virtue of the fact that, you know, I'm up against white supremacy, aren't I? Basically, I'm putting myself and the everything that I do in the spotlight in that regard. So I'm very aware of that. So that I can't approach that in a way where, you know, I'm just going to be like a daisy in the wind. I've got to be able to withstand certain pressures. Some of which I'm fortunate that, as we've talked about in social work, people are a little bit more aware of some of these issues. But of course, racism still exists, as we know. But I'm still faced a kind of personal, professional, in a cultural way by factors of white supremacy, both directly and indirectly as a result of that. So that requires me really to be pure, proactive, and unapologetic, you know, combative at times, militant, but not in a way that's, you know, uncontrolled and savage or, you know, subhuman, as sometimes black people can be framed, but just in a way where I think anybody who feels like they're put in a desperate position where it's literally life and death for some black people. It's for some people, it's like they'd be an end all of their careers if they are, you know, potentially going to be struck off the social work register for, you know, institutional racism. So that's why I have to sort of conduct myself in that way. Also then, I mean, just to dissect it a little bit, pure in the sense that I believe that I'm authentic and I'm fully committed to anti-racism and I embody social work values. I don't kind of, that might sound quite egocentric, but I just have to believe that that's what I'm about. And, I kind of try to, keep reassuring myself of that by doing certain things, both personally and professionally, that make me think, yeah, I'm as pure as I can be. Proactive in the sense that I've done a lot of work off my own steam, with the support of my colleagues and my organisation and members. And I've got a very supportive manager who I consider to be a mentor and an ally. I don't say that lightly. Nonetheless, most of my anti-racism outputs over the last 18 months have required me to instigate them. And I don't say that to sound big-headed. It is just, it's fact. And I think the report I referred to, that was published for George Floyd's anniversary kind of evidences that. And finally, unapologetic in my language, tone, decision making at times. As I mentioned before, I've had to be assertive, I've had to be bold and a bit ruthless really in some of the articles that I've put. Arguably put my neck on the line, raise my head above the precipice. The hammer of white supremacy is probably waiting there somewhere to put me back in my place at some point. But I just felt I needed to do that to resurrect the importance of anti-racism in social work, really.
You've mentioned a few times as we've been talking about, I get like a sense of like, I don't know if you would frame it this way, but I kind of get, so tell me if I'm off, okay. But this like vulnerability, this position of vulnerability that you're in, because you're doing this work and you're doing this work as a Black man.
That's the one. Yeah.
In this white supremacist society and how it spills into the profession. And then, so I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that and like, where do you see, pushback kind of happening on what you're working on?
Well, the pushback, I think, presents itself in different ways. Sometimes it's just a stonewall silence from those who, you would look to make some change, push some influence in their particular space or their particular remit or responsibilities. There's just a stonewall silence. So that's one particular reaction. Others are sort of seek and destroy. And I think that can happen both at an individual or interpersonal level, where people might not even know they're doing it sometimes. They might not even be consciously aware. But there can be almost it can feel like people trying to trip you up or make things more difficult for you. Or, I've talked about some of the projects I've been involved in, but those were just tip of the iceberg, to be honest. There's been an absolute plethora. And with that, I would say, actually, it's been fairly straightforward in that, as I say, I've had to be a self-starter with stuff. And although, I've collaborated and I've tried to partner with people, both internally within my organisation and externally, I've had to be quite dogged, really, and narrow-minded. So in some ways, I've shielded myself from that. Also, COVID has helped inadvertently, really, with the pandemic and working from home. I've just been a lot more productive, where I would normally be traveling the country and, maybe not as productive because of that. So because of those things, I feel that I've perhaps been shielded from some of the silence and the attempts to trip me up, but they've been there nonetheless. And I suppose more recently, I've become more aware of that, and I've not only had to manage the the challenges and obstacles of championing anti-racist sort of social work. I've also had to then use some energy and some headspace for navigating these, unfortunate events, shall we say, that arise, where you would expect people, both near and far, to kind of know a bit better, really, and to sort of, I guess, show more loyalty to the movement. And so that can be both disappointing, but also, I guess, it fuels me to want to, push on.
Do you have concerns of what could happen to you within social work based on the work you're doing?
I suppose I'd be, fibbing if I said it hadn't crossed my mind. But I'd like to think that, I'm not a religious person, but I am a spiritual person, in the sense that, I don't try to, I believe in karma and those sort of things, for example. And I don't think there's anything that I've done which I feel uncomfortable with, both currently or in retrospect. I'm aware that, even innocent black people get mauled sometimes. And I suppose I have to just kind of focus on the positive and be optimistic. And I'd like to think that I've never been critical of individuals, more about policies and structures and organizations. And I think that although it's been robust challenge at times, it's always been professional, it's always been coherent and credible, it's always been evidence-based. You see what I mean? So although the rug might get pulled at some point, well, I just have to deal with that in the same way that everybody has to deal with the challenges that life throws at them. But one of the most important things for me is being able to rest my head easy at night, knowing that I've done what I can do for the right causes, because the situation is so desperate, really, locally and globally, that it just requires me to do that. So I just, I can only hope that karma looks on that favorably and the other spiritual ideologies that I'm into.
I really appreciate you sharing that perspective, and kind of that deeper sense too of like what fuels you. I think that's so important because this is hard work, and everyone doing it because I've talked to so many different, I'm always talking to different folks, there's that fuel, like people have to have that fuel and then keep refueling because it can get, it can deplete.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it can. And, I've had my moments. It's not all sort of, how can you say? Although I guess it may appear, because of the social media persona and the various outputs, as I said, that there's been over the last year, I think there might be a tendency to think that he's just all, he's happy all the time. He's always upbeat. I'm sure my wife would tell a very different story. And, I know that I'm not always cheery and light all the time. But, you can't be with anti-racism in social work. We're not talking about, X Factor or, stuff where it's just all fairy and light. It's serious stuff. It's life-threatening stuff. It's career-ending stuff. So I have to counteract that, I feel, with bringing a certain charisma to it, but it's difficult to maintain, and I don't achieve it all the time.
Are there specific, kind of like agenda items or policies that you're currently working on as part of an overall anti-racism agenda within social work?
At a policy level, yeah. There's a couple. Well, there is an advisory group that I'm now part of, which is it derives from a government department, the Department of Health and Social Care, and it's a standard called the Workforce Race and Equality Standard, which will be rolled out across the country. We're currently in the kind of the early stages of that, and it's around collecting the data of the workforce in terms of their ethnic diversity, the experiences that they have, the outcomes, in terms of, complaints, and various other metrics. It's very much in the early stage, and I've only just, I think we'll be having our first meeting, proper meeting next week. So I'm really pleased that at a policy level, nationally, that's something that a government department is supporting. And obviously I'm pleased to be part of that. I'll be very much kind of pushing the anti-racism agenda, of course, as well as raising the profile of social work generally, because sometimes I think it is overshadowed by the health service in our country. Don't know if you're aware of that or if there's a similar thing that happens in the USA. So that's one area of policy that I'm involved in. The other area, I suppose, less formal than that. I've written extensively about the regulatory standards which social workers are held to account over, and the fact that they don't explicitly include anti-racist, anti-oppressive, or anti-discriminatory values and ethics. It's something I feel strongly about, and my organisation BASW are also on board with that campaign. So that's something that is ongoing, that we're hoping that we can work with the regulator to try and revisit those standards. And also, at the moment, those standards refer to social workers' kind of general conduct and interactions with with service users. Given the events of the last year, I think it's probably also important that we include the relationship, the conduct between colleagues as well, in that needs to be explicitly included, about that being, kind of anti-racist, anti-oppressive, because there is a lot of racism that goes on between colleagues. There's also a lack of accountability in terms of employers and what they should be providing in terms of protections and support for social workers of colour. So there's some interwoven, kind of separate but interwoven campaigns there, which I think it's important that social work generally gets on board with in this country.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you talk a little bit about that final piece you were saying about the protections for social workers of color and, why those protections are needed?
Mm-hmm. So the protections are, how I envisage this is, institutional racism, clearly exists in abundance, as I've mentioned before. And it's as if that is just completely ignored for social workers of colour, and they're expected to just get on with the job anyway. So the racism that they might experience from service users, so children and families, adults, other professionals and so on, that's one aspect of it. But then they've got the racism they might get from their colleagues, their employers, the racism they might face in terms of career progression, all sorts of, multi-dimensional and racism, but also racism that will affect people at different stages of their careers potentially. And there's just no regard for that. And so I think it's important that there are protections put in place at a kind of organizational level or local level, but also a national level as well, that recognizes that there is this additional burden that social workers of colour have in comparison with their white colleagues. And with that should be the necessary support. And I've written an article on this, which is called How to Promote an Anti-Racist Culture in Social Work. And it outlines different solutions that I feel could really help social work organisations, or any organisation really, but because social work's my bread and butter, that's what I talk about. But there's lots of transferable solutions there, which aren't necessarily going to break the bank either. It just requires, a new way of thinking, a different reframing of how protections and support are provided, not just for people of colour, not just for social workers of colour, but for all the cultural or diverse needs within the workplace based on people's protected characteristics. Do you see what I mean? So ideally, it might look differently in different organisations, but there's an overarching national framework that kind of it gives employers something to aspire to be held accountable to, for social workers of colour to complain to, perhaps, if they feel they're being mistreated. Do you see what I mean? Whereas at the moment, we just don't have any of that, and it's just like, just get on with it, basically. Yeah.
So we'll definitely link to that article. I appreciate you, sharing about that. And just to kind of touch on solutions, you mentioned one, that there would be like these mechanisms that social workers of color would have protections. They'd be able to bring up incidents, of mistreatment that they're experiencing. What are just like maybe like one or two other solutions that you touch on?
Okay, well, in the article, there's actually a framework as well that I created called the Anti-Racist Commitment Framework. which gives an overarching perspective on how anti-racism could be implemented within the workplace. So just to give you a brief overview of those then, the first strand is around accelerating diversity within an organization. So building a workforce that's reflective of the local community. And then in the article, I give a few examples of how that might be done. The other strand is about educating, empowering and equipping the workforce, which is about training and development and ensuring that anti-racist training is incorporated, but also caters for people's different learning styles. So not on an individual basis, because of course that would just be, impossible, but rather than just, a one-size-fits-all approach, there's actually some different types of training or professional development that people can tap into based on their particular learning style. And again, I give some examples. Another strand is leading by example. So how senior managers and heads of service can demonstrate that they're committed to working in an anti-racist and anti-oppressive and anti-discriminatory way and instilling that within the workforce. And then the final strand is about building transparency. So that's using data, not just collecting data, but actually using the data that we have to implement some of the protections and support that I mentioned before.
That's great. Thank you for covering all that. I have a couple other questions for you as we get towards the end of our discussion. And again, I'm so grateful for this conversation.
Me too.
And for the work you do, and I look forward to continued communication.
Yeah, me as well.
How do you see, I know you've written about kind of like some of your background in some of your writing. Mm-hmm. How do you see race and class intersecting in terms of like how it impacts who you are and what you bring to the work you do?
Well, I spoke at an event recently called the Working Class Academics Conference, where I got to present almost, I guess, my life story or my pathway into social work, which was a little bit like This Is Your Life, if you ever saw that program back in the day. I don't know if you got that in the USA. So yeah, I'd also captured it in the book Outlanders that I referred to before, in a story called Ambition Navigation, which charts the pathway. This opportunity at the conference was about presenting that to an audience virtually. So it's actually very timely that you asked that question. In terms of my background, both my parents have been in sort of reasonably paid jobs, not fantastically paid, but certainly quite unpredictable at times. And I've had to, we had sort of free school meals and things like that on occasion. And, I come from a predominantly white British council estate in Sheffield. So my experience is probably quite unique compared to some other black guys, from similar sort of West Indian backgrounds such as myself. So because of that, I suppose, it gave me a unique outlook as well. And some of that sort of involved me falling into social work by accident, which I cover in the story. So I'll not, kind of steal my own thunder. But by falling into social work, it kind of, I guess, it just took me on a bit of a conveyor belt, if I'm honest. That I found myself sort of making decisions, going for jobs, really kind of wanting to make a difference, I suppose, without me ever really consciously thinking about it. And then now I find myself in this position where all of the things that I've previously done, which is quite a lot of different social work roles, such as working for a youth offending team, I've worked with care leavers, I've worked with foster children and families, I've worked with, kind of adult offenders, various things in the frontline roles that I had. But looking back, it was all kind of, I'm probably getting all spiritual, but it was as if it was meant to work out that way, really, for me to be able to have all the kind of sort of internal resources that I need for what I'm doing at the moment. I suppose the other thing I should say is that although I come from a very working class background, and I'm very proud of that, and I do wear it like a badge, sometimes when I'm around sort of middle class people, and social work can be quite middle class in the UK. I find myself maybe talking a bit broader without even realizing it, or body language might change without me being consciously aware. So yeah, I do wear it as a bit of a badge of honor, and I'm fortunate enough to live in a fairly affluent place at the moment. So again, I find myself switching into working class mode sometimes down at the pub inadvertently. But I'm very proud, as I say, of the working class roots that I have.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
So what do you love about this work?
Do you mean anti-racism specifically or social work generally?
Well, at this point for you, can you separate that?
Kind of, in the sense that, we talked about this kind of resistance, I guess, that there is in some ways to anti-racism within social work. And because, I'm not in a frontline social work role, both of those things kind of mean that what I'm doing is almost, it feels at times like working, it's a bit insular. Possibly because I'm working from home as well, and I have done all throughout the pandemic. So it just feels very insular and very as if, as I said, there's just a bit of a silence from some quarters. So in terms of being able to separate it, I can easily do that sometimes. It's difficult to separate the work-life balance, honestly. That's one of my challenges. But yeah, it's not so difficult to separate the anti-racism from the social work, because it's a bit like, well, the way I go about it as well is that although I specifically badge it as anti-racism in social work, it's actually universal as well. It's applicable. A lot of it is transferable to other professions, and I've worked with people on the periphery of social work, and some from completely different professions as well. So I sort of want to keep that universality about it, and obviously I badge it as social work, but there is this kind of gulf, it feels like sometimes, sadly, just because it doesn't always get the kind of reception from those with power and influence that I would like.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So as we're wrapping up, what, since you're on this platform, and you've got the mic, any, final thoughts you want to get out there to anyone who's listening or reading the transcript?
Okay. I suppose just do the right thing. Might sound really simple, but just do the right thing. When faced with evidence, base your thinking on that evidence. And then when you get a new piece of evidence, put the two together and join the dots, and, just keep doing the right thing each time. That's my kind of simplistic way of concluding this. And in terms of race, I think, just look at all the outcomes. It's overwhelming, as I was saying before. It's abundantly clear who's at the bottom of the food chain as far as socioeconomics, sociopolitics, not just in England, but globally. You look across the world, you look at the history, it's kind of just, it's overbearingly clear, that black people of colour are sort of at the bottom of the food chain, as I say. And although there are shining examples of black people being successful, some of it is about how we define that success as well. Because if we're talking about success within a capitalist culture, then is that really success? Is that just material success? For me, I think I'm a bit deeper than that, as I was saying before. And I think, we need real equality in terms of the way that black people are positioned globally.
Wayne, thank you so much for your message, for taking the time to talk with me and come on doing the work. And most of all, thank you for doing the work out in the community.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that. And when you reached out to me and said, do you want to come on doing the work? I thought, well, yeah, because I am doing the work, and I'm literally, and it might sound a bit egocentric but I sort of feel like I do live and breathe it at the moment. So I really appreciate you inviting me on this, because, it is a great opportunity. I'll continue to do the work best I can. I know that it won't last forever, I'm conscious that there's a window there, and there's also a kind of limit that I have to put on it as well. That's the reality. I don't want to sort of I've been referred to as the Malcolm X of social work from certain people in England. I don't want to be framed as that individual all of the time, for the rest of my life. But whilst I'm doing this, I'll do the best I can. So thanks ever so much.
Thank you for listening to Doing the Work, Frontline Stories of Social Change. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. Please follow on Twitter and leave positive reviews on iTunes. If you're interested in being a guest or know someone who's doing great work, please get in touch. And thank you for doing real work to make this world a better place.